Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome back to our Shabdrung UK lecture series. It's a pleasure to welcome Mr. Jetsun Deleplanque tonight. He's literally just submitted his PhD a few days ago, so congratulations, Jetsun, on tonight's topic, the Shabdrung. So we're very much looking forward to it. I won't say much more. So Jetsun will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to write them in the chat. And thank you, Jetsun, and welcome.
Thank you, Jamyang, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to present some of my work here. Jamyang and I first met many, many years ago now when we were both very young undergraduate students at SOAS in London, both studying Tibetan. And I think it probably speaks to Jamyang's brilliance or my lack thereof, that even though we started our undergraduate studies at around the same time, Jamyang finished his PhD many years ago. And as Jamyang just said, I'm just finishing my PhD now. I would like to begin by thanking all of you for taking the time off your busy schedules to come and listen to me speak about one of the most remarkable figures of Tibetan and Himalayan history, the great Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal. Before I start speaking about Bhutan's founding figure, I thought I would first introduce myself and speak a little bit about how I came to study this figure and this period of Tibetan and Himalayan history in the first place. As Jamyang has mentioned, I'm finishing up my PhD at the University of Chicago. And so much of what I will be speaking about today is based on my dissertation work. I was actually originally scheduled to give this presentation about a month ago, but the last minute scramble to submit my dissertation on time to my committee and getting ready to graduate in just a few days had to push me to delay. So again, I'm thankful to Jamyang for being so accommodating in that regard. So broadly speaking, my dissertation is interested in exploring the intersection of religion and politics in the Tibetan cultural sphere by exploring the founding of theocratic governments in the region during the 17th century. The 17th century is this really fascinating period of Tibetan history, when within the space of just a couple of decades, we have the creation of two entirely new forms of government that were headed by religious hierarchs who were both conceived as the human embodiments of transcendental or divine figures. And that's of a transcendental or divine figure. And that's the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And these two new governments were the Drukpa state of Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal and the Ganden Podrong government of the fifth Dalai Lama, Ngawang Losang Gyatso. And these two new forms of government were quite a radical departure from previous ideas of governance in the Tibetan region. So much of my dissertation work consists in tracing some of the material and ideological conditions that led to their rise in the 17th century. And this sometimes comes as a surprise to people interested in Tibet, where the figure of the Dalai Lama has become kind of so ubiquitous with the Tibetan state that people find it difficult to imagine that there were other systems of government for much of Tibetan history before the arrival of the institution of the Dalai Lamas. So part of my work is looking at the period preceding the founding of both states in the 17th century, and then looking specifically at the founding of Bhutan and the figure of Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, and how his administration articulated a distinct form of Buddhist government which married the normally distinct domains of the religious and the political or the temporal. And so as you will see over the course of this talk, the founding of these new governments was based on a theory of governance known as Chösizongdel or Chösiniden in Tibetan, which literally translates as something like the union of religious and temporal domains. And in the Buddhist world, the Tibetan region is really the only one to have really thoroughly collapsed these two spheres into one. The more prevalent example throughout much of Buddhist history was to have these two spheres separate. You'd have the temporal sphere or the political sphere that would be embodied by a king. And then on the other hand, you'd have the religious sphere that would be embodied or represented by the Buddhist Sangha. And then you'd have these two spheres interact and engage with each other, sometimes in a cooperative relationship and sometimes in more antagonistic ways. So in a nutshell, much of my dissertation work has been to try to figure out how and why the Tibetan region somehow ended up collapsing these two spheres into one figure, who acted both as a religious or even divine figure, but also as a king. which is pretty much how Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal was conceived. There's a few reasons for how I got into this project. And the first of these is just really wanting to contribute to the historiography of Bhutan. As all of you know, Bhutan is this small Himalayan kingdom that not so long ago was largely unknown to much of the world. And one could argue that Bhutan is still largely unknown to much of the world. My first encounters with Bhutanese was while attending boarding school as a child in northern India. I went to this prominent boarding school in India where a lot of Bhutanese send their children. And I've since been fortunate to live in the kingdom for a number of years, one of which was spent as a student at the monastery of Tango in the Thimphu Valley. Now, anyone visiting Bhutan will be immediately struck by the ubiquity of the figure of Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal throughout the kingdom. His image can be found virtually everywhere, from temple altars to the walls of homes or businesses to even taxi dashboards. And as the founder of the Bhutanese state, he's revered as a founding father to all Bhutanese. And as every Bhutanese knows very well, their existence as a nation can be traced to his life and activities. I was always surprised, though, by the limited scholarship done on this figure and the period of Bhutan's founding. Most Bhutanese will be able to recount to you the basic contours of his life. But beyond that, and especially the kind of larger context in which Bhutan was founded, only a few scholars will be able to speak at length about. And I can see that there's a few of these scholars in the room. So first and foremost, the intention behind my work has been to really contribute to the scholarship on Bhutan and to add complexity to the picture of Bhutan's founding. Then a second important intention behind my work is an attempt to enrich the popular discourse on Bhutan in the West. So Bhutan, which is often known as the last Shangri-La, is often romanticized as something of an answer to the various ills of the modern world. And it has come to occupy a space in the Western imagination that in many respects, I think, speaks more to developments in the Western hemisphere than to the small Himalayan nation. So in very broad terms, then, an intention behind my work is to shift conversations about Bhutan away from Western projections and onto distinctly Bhutanese expressions of national identity. I'd be happy to speak more about this or any other aspect of my dissertation work in the Q&A if anyone's interested, but let's move on to the specifics of this talk. So I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, and to just help me clarify my points, there's a few pictures and maps. Here we go. Can everybody see this? Yes? Okay. So my talk today will be focusing on the great Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, which, as I just mentioned, is the founding figure of the Bhutanese state. It would be difficult to underestimate what a significant figure the Shabdrung was for not only Bhutan, but the entire Tibetan region. As I will discuss in the course of this talk, Bhutan was founded some decades prior to the Ganden Phodrang government of the Dalai Lamas in Tibet, and there's cause to believe that the Gelugpa government in Lhasa was significantly influenced by what was happening in Bhutan, even though the two governments pretty much hated each other and went to war a number of times. Surprisingly, we have very few sources on the life of Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal. He left behind very few writings of his own, and as a result, it's quite difficult to know exactly how he himself conceived of his life and what exactly his vision for Bhutan was. For the life of the Shabdrung and the early period of Bhutan's founding, we basically have one major and authoritative source, and that's the biography of Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, written by his colleague and contemporary, Sunkenshin Gyatso. And so here I have an image showing you on the left Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, and on the right is a painting of Sunkenshin. So in many ways, I would argue that Sunkenshin is as significant a figure as Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal for the founding of Bhutan. His biography of the Shabdrung is in many ways much more than a biography. It's what John Arducci, who also gave a talk to this group recently, what John Arducci has described as a political statement articulating the theoretical foundations of the Bhutanese state. Tsang Kenshin's biography of the Shabdrung became the major source for, I would say, all subsequent Bhutanese scholars and historians to not only describe the figure of the Shabdrung, but to describe the theoretical underpinnings of the Bhutanese state. So in many ways, one could say that Sunkenshin is the author, or I like to say the literary architect of the Bhutanese state. So my talk today will heavily draw on Sunkenshin and his biography, but also talk a bit about who he was and how he came to write this political manifesto, for lack of a better word. But in order to tell this story of the Shabdrung and the founding of Bhutan and of Sunkenshin's role in all of this, we first need to take quite a few steps back and look at the kind of broader developments taking place in Tibet, leading up to this really fascinating moment of state building. I think it's important for us to remember that the Shabdrung was not born in a vacuum, and in many ways, what he accomplished in his life reflects broader developments taking place in the greater Tibetan region during this period. So in order to tell this story and explain all of this, my talk will be divided into three broad sections. So the first section will be looking at the trajectory of Tibetan Buddhist institutions leading up to the 17th century, when Bhutan and the Tibetan government of the Dalai Lamas were founded, in order to contextualize the birth of Bhutan as a state within the broader developments taking place in the Tibetan region. Then the second section will be looking at the history of the Drukpa school of Tibetan Buddhism, of which Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal was recognized as the head, and a discussion of the kind of dispute that eventually led him to take his fateful journey southward from his home monastery in southwestern Tibet, and when he eventually found the Bhutanese state. And as you will see, it's a story that's full of political intrigue and makes for a pretty riveting narrative, I think. And then finally, in a third section, we'll look at the figure of Sunkenshin and the articulation of the Bhutanese state by him sometime after Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal's death. And so we'll look at his life and how his vision of the Bhutanese state became really a template for later Bhutanese authors to formulate a Bhutanese national identity. So it's my hope that through exploring these three dimensions, my talk can give just as much as just a little glimpse of the kind of remarkable Buddhist vision that was articulated in Bhutan during the 17th century and the kind of fascinating people that were behind it. And I must say that I prepared this talk with an audience in mind that's not at all familiar with any of this. So for the few experts in the room, please bear with me. Okay, so let's move to part one. So we look at the big picture of Tibet and the kind of historical trajectory that led to the founding of theocratic governments in the 17th century. So we need to begin this story, I think, as early as the 11th century, when the majority of the Tibetan schools or sects of Buddhism became established. This period is generally referred to in traditional Tibetan historiography as the Chidar, or the later diffusion of Buddhism to Tibet. And so the first diffusion had happened some centuries prior, when Tibet was this great empire that controlled much of Central Asia and large swaths of what would be modern-day China or India. But then when the empire collapsed, completely collapsed in the 9th century, Tibet became partitioned into lots of small kingdoms or principalities that were governed by various rulers belonging to Tibet's prominent clans. And one thing that we often tend to overlook when speaking about the period of Buddhist institutionalization in Tibet is the kind of social and political structure within which Tibetan Buddhist sects were established. When Tibetans and Indian Buddhist pundits started crossing over the Himalayas again and exchanged Buddhist teachings, there was the very real situation of basically needing to fund these projects, and then to fund the establishment of the monasteries of Tibet's new Buddhist sects. And so for this, the early schools of Tibetan Buddhism turned to Tibet's ancient and most powerful institution on the plateau. And that was the clan structure of Tibet. As I just mentioned, when the Tibetan Empire collapsed, Tibet became partitioned into lots of small principalities that were ruled and governed by Tibet's prominent clans. It would be difficult to underestimate how important Tibet's clan structure was at the time. Basically, the whole of the Tibetan social order was governed by this complex system of allegiances and conflicts between powerful clan establishments. And in the vacuum that the fall of the empire had caused, many of the more prominent clans were engaged in basically regular warfare with other clans trying to seize more and more swaths of territory on the plateau with the kind of ambition to, in a way, reunite Tibet and mimic the empire. So in this environment of really great competition, the prominent clans of Tibet saw a real opportunity in the sponsorship of Buddhism for the kind of prestige that it could bring them, and how doing so they could kind of emulate the kings of the empire. I don't mean to take too much of a cynical outlook on the flourishing of Buddhism in Tibet. And there are plenty of other reasons why Buddhism flourished in Tibet during this period. But I think it would be a mistake to forget the kind of political and economic dimensions of the adoption of Buddhism by the Tibetan elite. So basically, the first sects of Tibetan Buddhism were established in relation to and modeled after Tibet's ancient clan structure. This means that as monastic institutions were founded, these became associated and run by noble families within the clan system. If we think about it, the majority of the early sects or schools of Tibetan Buddhism were identified not by the particular doctrines that they emphasized, but by the site of their establishment or their clan affiliation. For example, the Sakya, the Jigung, the Taglong, or the Tselpa Kagyu were all named after the region in which they were established, and they were governed by the noble families that were ruling these areas. The Ngokpa Kagyu, for example, on the other hand, was named directly after the clan to which it belonged. So in order for the material wealth that these noble families invested in the newly founded monasteries, in order for that wealth to stay within the hands of these noble families, the majority of the early Tibetan sects followed what has been termed the Kuwan, or the uncle-nephew mode of abbatial succession. And here I have a slide to just shows a kind of graph of how the uncle-nephew mode of succession works. But basically, according to the system, the succession of religious and temporal powers over a particular estate or principality would occur within a single family network. So at each generation, you'd have a married brother who would continue the family line, and he would transmit the temporal powers of the family domain to one of his sons, while another brother would be ordained as a monk and become the hierarch of the religious institution. And then the religious hierarch would then be succeeded by one of his nephews. So the institutional model that Tibet's early sects of Buddhism followed was really insular in nature, where each sect was under the control and the maintenance of a specific noble house or clan. And each house was protected from outside interference through the adoption of this uncle-nephew mode of succession. So basically everything stayed insular. What this meant, though, is that there was little opportunity for monasteries to expand and to gather patronage outside of their direct family or clan affiliation. So much of the early centuries of Buddhist institutionalization in Tibet is based on this mutual relationship between clans and monasteries, where the clans are providing the material support to the monasteries, and in exchange, they're getting the kind of prestige and social capital that helps them in the fierce competition with other clans for political hegemony on the plateau. Now, I would say that around the 14th century, there are two things that happen that really completely disrupt and change this system. And in many ways, these two things happen in tandem and they mutually reinforce each other. And these two things are the advent of printing technologies and the introduction in Tibet of the Tulku institution, or the mode of succession. It would be difficult to understate the kind of profound impact that these two developments had on the social order of Tibet. And these two developments, I think, can be directly linked to the rise of theocratic governments in the 17th century. So let's start with printing. The development of block printing, or xylographic printing as it's called, meant that monasteries were now able to disseminate Buddhist literature in ways that were just unheard of before. Coinciding with the introduction of these technologies, there's this complete efflorescence of various genres of Tibetan literature. And one of the most important genres was the writing of biographies of Buddhist masters, what is known in Tibetan as namtar. And so suddenly now the Buddhist path became represented and embodied not by some kind of abstruse classical Indian treatises, but by the figure and the life of the Tibetan Buddhist Lama, who could embody the Buddhist path that could be emulated by others. There's a lot of work that's been done on biography in Tibet and how biography basically infused the Tibetan Buddhist Lama with a kind of charisma that placed him or her at the center of the Tibetan cultural imagination. The kind of authority embodied by the religious hierarch and represented through the medium of biography was no longer built on clan affiliation or ancestry, but rather the capacity for an individual's life to be modeled according to a set of idealized Buddhist truths. In other words, the Buddhist Lama's authority became constructed through the characteristic Buddhist activities of scholasticism and virtuosity in yogic practices, as opposed to ancestry or clan affiliation. And so that's a really significant shift that happens. Then the second development that was to have a really dramatic impact on the development of Buddhist institutions in Tibet was the introduction of the Tulku mode of succession. And so for those that are not familiar with the Tulku institution in Tibet, this was a system of succession that was gradually established in Tibet, beginning as early as the 12th century, but really reaching prominence around the 14th and 15th century. And it's a system whereby a child would be recognized as the direct rebirth of a preceding Buddhist Lama by his or her disciples, and would be invested with the previous Lama's spiritual authority as well as material heritage. And so, as many of you will know, this is a really unique development to Tibet, and it hasn't happened in any other Buddhist context. Tibetans, though, could make recourse to classical Buddhist understandings of emanation and yogic virtuosity to basically make the claims that an especially advanced master of tantric Buddhist practices could basically control the continuum of consciousness in the passage from death to rebirth and pretty much reincarnate indefinitely to fulfill his or her altruistic mission as a bodhisattva. So starting in the 14th century and leading up to the 17th century, the Tulku mode of succession became adopted by the majority of Tibet's Buddhist schools, and it gradually came to replace the uncle-nephew mode of succession. There are, of course, some exceptions to this, like the Sakya school, for example, which still today follows the uncle-nephew mode of succession and is still governed by members of the Kun clan. But by and large, by the 17th century, the vast majority of Tibetan Buddhist schools had adopted this system, and the consequences were pretty devastating for Tibet's ancient clan structure. Through the adoption of the Tulku system, individual clans basically lost control over the process of succession within their monastic institutions. And it opened up the possibilities for monasteries to find their hierarchs or their head lamas in other prominent clans or families. And then by creating ties with other prominent noble houses and clans, monastic institutions were suddenly able to gather unprecedented wealth and influence over Tibet. And so leading up to the 17th century, we start to see monasteries start to overtake secular rulers in the region in the amount of power and influence that they can exert. And at that point, there's pretty much an inversion of the power structure, where now the clans start to become dependent on these powerful Buddhist monastic institutions for their own survival. And so standing at the pinnacle of these monastic institutions is, of course, the figure of the religious hierarch or the head of the sect, who by now is widely revered across Tibet as the primary source of power and authority. And so by this point, the figure of the Buddhist Lama in Tibet comes to occupy much more than just a spiritual role. His position involves a whole range of economic, legal, and even political functions. And so now he's elevated to the highest echelons of the Tibetan social order. And the religious hierarch had all the elements in hand to basically envision a Buddhist state over which he stood at the helm. And of course, this is what we see happen in the 17th century with the creation of these Buddhist governments ruled by religious hierarchs. So I hope this wasn't too confusing, but that's kind of basically the broad social and political picture of the trajectory that led to the founding of theocratic governments in the region during the 17th century. The reality was, of course, much more complicated than this basic account I just gave. And I'm happy to speak more about this in the Q&A. But now let's move on to the specificities of the Drukpa school and the Gya clan leading up to the life of Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal. And as you will see, the developments that I've just described, especially the introduction of the Tulku mode of succession, had really important implications for the life of the Shabdrung and the founding of Bhutan. So let's move to part 2. So as many of you will know, the Drukpa school of Tibetan Buddhism was founded in the 12th century by the great yogi Tsangpa Gyare Yeshe Dorje. As his name entails, Tsangpa Gyare, or the Repa, the cotton-clad yogi of the Gya, he belonged to the important Gya clan of Tibet, which was established in the upper Nyang Valley of Tsang in Western Tibet. So here I have a map just to give you a picture of the region. And so what I've kind of highlighted in yellow is the Nyang Valley of Tsang. And so we have Lhasa on the right, which is the capital of U, and Shigatse, the capital of Tsang. So Tsangpa Gyare was a disciple of Lingrepa, who received the Kagyu teachings from Drukpa Dorje Gyalpo, who was one of Gampopa's principal disciples. Tsangpa Gyare had many disciples over the course of his life, and he founded 2 primary monasteries. One was called Druk, or Druk Sewa Changchubling, which is where he had this vision of 9 dragons. And that's how the lineage took the name Drukpa, or dragon. And then the other monastery that he founded was Ralung, which became the principal seat of the Drukpa sect. Ralung was this really huge estate with many buildings, administering a whole swath of land and territory in the Nyang Valley. And the estate was run by the Gya clan, of which Tsangpa Gyare belonged. And upon Tsangpa Gyare's death, the Drukpa school that he had founded followed the uncle-nephew mode of succession within the Gya. So after his death, Tsangpa Gyare was succeeded by his nephew, Dharma Sengye Sangye Unre, who was then succeeded by his own nephew, and so on and so forth, all the way down to Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, who was the 17th throne holder of Ralung and a sign of the Gya clan. So here I have, just to show you, a list of the Ralung throne holders, starting with Tsangpa Gyare at 1 and going all the way to 17 in Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal. And so they were all nephews of each other. And actually, there are a couple of exceptions here and there where a nephew was not present, and so the throne was passed, could be passed from father to son. And that could happen where the father would, prior to taking full ordination, be able to procreate and have a son. So basically, for much of the early history of the Drukpa Kagyu, the sect was controlled and governed by the Gya family at Ralung. But then something kind of unprecedented happened during the tenure of the 13th hierarch and throne holder of Ralung, which is Gyalwangje Kyunga Peljor. And so, as you can see on the slide. So this was during the 15th century when more and more Tibetan Buddhist sects began to adopt the Tunku mode of succession. And many of the changes that I described earlier were beginning to take place. And so at that point, the Drukpa sect made a decision to adopt the Tunku mode of succession and recognized Gyalwangje Kyunga Peljor as the rebirth of Tsangpa Gyare, even though they were something like 300 years apart from each other. And this wasn't really a problem for the Gya clan, since Gyalwangje belonged to the Gya clan, and so he was recognized as the head of the Drukpa sect, following both the Tunku system and the uncle-nephew system. But then, upon the death of Gyalwangje Kyunga Peljor, there was some complications. So first, there wasn't an immediate birth in the Gya family after Gyalwangje's death. And so the Gya family was not able to recognize one of their progeny as the rebirth of Gyalwangje. And then second, there were a number of signs that pointed to a relationship that Gyalwangje had developed with the very powerful king of the region of Chayul to the east, whose name was Tashidargye. And so the disciples of Gyalwangje Kyunga Peljor eventually recognized the reincarnation of Gyalwangje in the family of this ruler, Tashidargye, in the Cha clan. So this was kind of a complicated situation for the Gya clan. By having accepted to recognize Gyalwangje Kyunga Peljor as a reincarnation of Tsangpa Gyare, they had basically opened the door to losing control over the process of succession for the head of the Drukpa sect of Tibetan Buddhism. And the fact that the reincarnation was found in the progeny of Tashi Dargye of the Jia clan, who was one of the most powerful leaders in Tibet at the time, meant, however, that the Drukpa sect could receive patronage on a scale that would really take it to new levels of height and influence. So in the end, the Gya accepted the situation and endorsed the recognition of Jamyang Cheki Drukpa, the son of the powerful ruler Tashi Dargye, as the reincarnation of Gyalwangje Khinka Beljor. And so luckily, because Jamyang Cheki Drukpa came from such a kind of wealthy and powerful background, he would lay no claim to Ralung, and he built his own monastery in the Cha region. So basically at this point, we have a kind of split in the institutional system of the Drukpa sect, with the creation of what has come to be termed the Gyalwang Drukchen Tuku line. So Ralung still followed the uncle-nephew system, but the head of the sect as a whole became slowly embodied in the Tulku system. And we have Tsang Gyare becoming the first Gyalwang Drukchen, and then the second would be Gyalwangje Khinka Beljor. And then as a third, we have Jamyang Cheki Drukpa. I hope that makes sense to everyone. So then, when Jamyang Cheki Drukpa dies, something kind of unusual happens again. There are no immediate sons born to the Gya or the Cha clans. And the disciples of Jamyang Cheki Drukpa recognize a child born to a small administrator in the Kongpo region as the next rebirth. This boy would turn out to be the great Khyentse Pema Karpo, who's the Drukpa sect's greatest master and scholar in pretty much all of its history. And so we can add here Khyentse Pema Karpo as the fourth Gyalwang Drukchen. So Pema Karpo's scholarship became famous really all over Tibet, and he brought this huge amount of prestige and wealth to the Drukpa sect. And Pema Karpo also laid no claims to the properties of his predecessors, and he built his own monastery of Druksanga Chiling in Kongpo, which became a really big establishment. So now, by the time of Pema Karpo's death, the stakes for finding his reincarnation were basically really high. And soon after his death, there's a male child born to the Gya family. And this is Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal. And so the Gya clan immediately endorsed the rebirth Shabdrung as the rebirth of Pema Karpo. But then, at the very same time, another major disciple of Pema Karpo, called Latsewa Ngawang Zompo, he found another child who belonged to the very powerful Chongye family. And he recognized this child as the rebirth of Pema Karpo. So we have basically two claimants to the reincarnation of Pema Karpo. And it's a kind of complicated situation. And at that time, even though the Tuku system of succession was a relatively new thing in the Drukpa sect, we just had 4 reincarnations so far, there was already a precedent that was established to consult one of the most important relics of the lineage to verify the authenticity of a reincarnation. And the relic in question is the Rangjung Kasarpana relic, which was basically a piece of the vertebrae of Tsang Gyare that was found in his funeral pyre after his cremation, and which was miraculously in the shape of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And so whenever a big decision had to be made in the sect, the relic would always be consulted. And all of the preceding Drukchen incarnations, including Jamyang Cheki Drukpa and Pema Karpo, they had been confirmed by the relic. So the relic was still in the possession of the Gya clan at Ralung. And according to the Ralung throne holder at the time, which was the Shabdrung's grandfather, the relic had confirmed that Shabdrung was the rebirth of Pema Karpo and no other candidate. But then Pema Karpo's student, Latsewa Ngawang Zompo, basically paid no heed to the Gya representatives, and he decided to enthrone his own candidate, Paksam Wampo, at Pema Karpo's monastery in Kongpo. And during the same time, the Gya clan decided to enthrone Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal at Ralung as the rebirth of Pema Karpo. So we have this situation, and I can add this here, where we have 2 claimants to the rebirth of Pema Karpo, who have both been enthroned as the rebirth of Pema Karpo and as the 5th Drukchen incarnations. On the one hand, we have Paksam Wampo, and then we have Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, who was also coincidentally the 17th throne holder of Ralung through the uncle-nephew system. So there were many attempts to resolve this dispute by pretty much all the important people in Tibet at the time. And finally, the whole matter was brought to the court of the king of Tsang, Namgyal, who basically ruled over the entirety of the central Tibetan region. And this was a really kind of difficult position for the king to be in. On the one hand, the Gya clan had these really convincing prophetic arguments supporting them. And on the other, it appears that he was really eager to maintain good relations with the powerful Chongye family, of which the other candidate, Paksam Wampo, belonged. And in the end, it's not really clear what made the king choose to support Paksam Wampo over Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, but it would appear that the situation was probably more political than anything. And also probably didn't help that when the Shabdrung went to meet him at the capital in Shigatse, he didn't show much deference to the king. In any case, the Gya clan and the Shabdrung categorically refused to relinquish their claims to the Gyalwang Drukchen incarnation line. And this was seen kind of a direct affront to the authority of the king. And then the final blow to the conflict came when the Shabdrung was traveling across the Yarlung Tsangpo River, and a dispute about who should cross the river first broke out between his attendants and the attendants of another important religious figure at the time. And the dispute apparently led to one of the attendants of the other religious figure to be injured. And so there was a formal complaint that was brought to the king. And that basically gave the king the kind of convenient excuse to basically crack down on the Shabdrung and on the Gya. And so the king immediately requested that the Gya pay an important fine, that they relinquish their claims to the Gyalwang Drukchen incarnation line, and that they surrender the Rangjung Kasarpana relic, the Drukpa Kagyu's most important relic. The Shabdrung, of course, categorically refused, and the king was rumored to have sent an army to Ralung. So at this point in the story, we're told that the Shabdrung, who was in his early 20s at the time, had a dream in which the tutelar deities of his lineage came to him and urged him to head south and take refuge there. So I've focused so far on the dispute over the Shabdrung's status as the reincarnation of Pema Karpo. I haven't told you anything about his childhood. So in this regard, we're basically told that he was this prodigious child right from the start, of course. And his biographer, Sunkenshin, spends a lot of pages telling us about his studies and how he is basically able to master all the major treatises of Buddhism very early on. What he was most impressive in, though, was his mastery of the tantric systems of the Drukpa Kagyu and his special relationship with the sect's protective deities, the most important of which was Yeshe Gompo, which is a raven-headed manifestation of Mahakala. So by then, the Shabdrung was already known for his mastery of occult practices, where he could basically call on the protective deities of the lineage to his aid at any time. So in any case, the Shabdrung has this dream in which Yeshe Gompo takes him to a place where he sees a bridge and a river, and he is told that this is where he needs to go. And this was later identified as the Pangrizampa Bridge in the Thimphu Valley. And so in the cover of night, the Shabdrung packs the most important relics of Ralung, including the Rangjungka Sarpana relic, and he starts his journey southward with his most trusted attendants. And he finally arrives in the region of Lomon, which is how Bhutan was, the region of Bhutan was called, where he's basically greeted by all the prominent families of the region who had important ties to Ralung. So as you can imagine, the king of Tsang was absolutely furious that the Shabdrung had left. And so he decided to send an army to Lomon to capture him. And this is known as the first war between Bhutan and Tibet, even though Bhutan wasn't founded as a state yet. The Shabdrung was defended by local Bhutanese militias who were able to basically defeat the army from Tsang, which was quite the humiliation for the king. But the victory of the Shabdrung was primarily interpreted as the result of his use of magical warfare, where the protective deities of the Drukpa sect created all kinds of inhospitable conditions for the invading force. And then on top of that, soon after the invasion, the king of Tsang and part of his family died of smallpox. And that was also interpreted as the direct result of the Shabdrung's magical powers. And so already early on, we start to see the Shabdrung's notoriety as this great sorcerer really take on. And so the king of Tsang was succeeded by his son, Karma Tenkyong Wangpo, of which we'll be speaking more after. So during this early period in Bhutan, the Shabdrung traveled from valley to valley, basically solidifying his relationships with all the prominent families of the region. He was offered the monastery of Tango in the Tipu Valley by Tsewang Tenzin, who's the grandson of the mad saint Drukpa Kinle, which Liz Monson spoke about a few months ago. And so he established himself there at this monastery of Tango. There's reason to believe that the Shabdrung's original plan was to stay in the region of Bhutan only temporarily and return to resume his duties at Ralung once the dispute over his status as the reincarnation of Pema Karpo could be settled. But then as time passed and the dispute with the kings of Tsang just got worse and worse, basically, there came the realization that a return to Tibet and to Ralung may not be a possibility after all. And so at this point, the Shabdrung decides to take this prolonged 3-year retreat in a mountain cave just opposite Tango and start to meditate on the future, basically. And so during this retreat, he contemplates either becoming a wandering yogi like Milarepa, or to take up the mantle of government and found a Buddhist state here in Bhutan. And so the biography tells us that basically during the retreat, all the protective deities of the land and of the Drukpa sect intervened in favor of establishing a new state. And so he emerges from his retreat in 1625, and he announces the founding of Bhutan. So at this point, the majority of the people in the new state pretty much all support him and pay him obeisance. But there's still a number of previously established sects that resist him and that see him as a threat to their power. So they kind of band together to oppose him, and they travel to Tsang and they rally the new king of Tsang to their cause. So at this point, the Shabdrung has built the first fortress of the many that he would become famous for. And so he built this fortress at Simtoka, which is a strategic site near Thimphu on the road to Punakha. And so the new king of Tsang sends an army to Bhutan, which marks the second invasion from Tibet. But then again, the army is defeated by the local militias and the Shabdrung's magical abilities. So following this conflict, the internal resistance to the Shabdrung's rule has pretty much been defeated. And so the Shabdrung spends the next decade really solidifying his place in the region by building the many fortresses at various strategic locations and establishing the central monastic body of the country, the Shungdratsang, which is still thriving till date. The most important fortress that he builds, and which becomes the seat of his government, is the Punakha Fudzong, or the Punakha fortress, which is known as the Puntang Dewachen Podong, which, as you can see, is this real architectural marvel. So at this point, the king of Tsang has other troubles to deal with. And so he basically decides to make peace, and he recognizes Bhutan as this independent entity. At this point, we need to take a pause, though, and I need to spend a second to talk about what's happening in Tibet. So while the Shabdrung is solidifying his position in Bhutan, there's these major developments that are happening in Tibet. So as I mentioned, the region was under the control of the Tsangpa dynasty. So these are the kings of Tsang with which the Shabdrung had been in a conflict. But as all this was happening, the Gelugpa sect, centered in Lhasa, began opposing the rule of the Tsangpa kings. And they forged an alliance with Mongol chieftains to the north. And so calling on the help of the Mongol chieftain Gushri Khan, the Gelugpa sect was able to overthrow the king of Tsang and establish a Buddhist state, which is quite similar to Bhutan, with at its head the fifth reincarnated hierarch of the sect, the fifth Dalai Lama. The Gelugpa takeover of Tibet was pretty brutal, and this is not the kind of picture of a peace-loving Tibet that we are used to hearing. The Mongol armies of Gushri Khan basically ravaged through the region, violently quashing any form of opposition to the new government. There was also significant religious persecution that happened, where you had many non-Gelugpa monasteries that were converted to the Gelugpa sect. And the Karma Kagyu school in particular bared a lot of persecution. And the 10th Karmapa hierarch, Chering Dorje, even had to flee Tibet and take refuge in modern-day Yunnan in China. So this has just happened in Tibet. So at this point in Bhutan, going back to Bhutan, the Shabdrung had just finished building the Punakha fortress and setting it up as the seat of the Bhutanese government. But now that the Ganden Podong government of the Dalai Lamas in Tibet had basically defeated all forms of opposition on the plateau, they decided that it was time to take over Bhutan. And you have to imagine the picture here. So Tibet is this huge force, which has all these Mongol warriors that have just basically taken over the entire plateau, stretching all the way to Ladakh in very little time, and they had not suffered a single defeat. And so everyone in the region was basically terrified of these Mongol warriors who were experts at horseback warfare. And so the Tibetan government decides to send 700 Mongol troops to Bhutan to quash this little insignificant government there. But then, to everyone's complete surprise, the Mongol armies are met with a complete and humiliating defeat. And the reasons for their defeat had probably more to do with the terrain of Bhutan than anything else. But the news spread throughout the Tibetan world, and the Shabdrung's notoriety as this powerful sorcerer just basically skyrocketed. And so in total humiliation, the Tibetan government tried a second invasion some years later, but then again, they're completely defeated and they had to retreat. So by that point, the Shabdrung was reaching the later part of his life, and having kind of neutralized the threat from Tibet, he spent much of his time consolidating the new government and instituting the various rituals and protocols conducted by the central monastic body. So he appointed a Jikempo, or a head abbot, to oversee the functioning of the central monastic body. And shortly before entering his final retreat, he appointed the Drukpa, or the civil regent, who would oversee the functioning of the more secular branches of government on his behalf. And so in 1651, the Shabdrung, probably knowing that death was near, decided to enter into a strict retreat, with only his personal attendant and the desi allowed to consult him if need be. And he eventually died in retreat that year, but as we will see, his death was kept secret for a very long time. But before getting into the death of the Shabdrung, it's important to say a few words about his succession. So we know that the Shabdrung favored a hereditary system of succession, despite the fact that so much of his life was spent emphasizing his status as a tuku. And as early as the period of consolidation, after his 3-year retreat, when he decided to found a state, he was already at work trying to produce an heir. And this was not a problem for his monastic status, since he had not yet taken full bhikshu vows. So eventually he had a son in 1631 with a consort named Gekardolma, and the son was named Jampal Dorje. The thing is, as soon as Jampal Dorje was born, then the Shabdrung decided to take full ordination vows with his teacher, Lhawang Lotar. The thing, though, is that in the years after the birth, some kind of tragedy occurred where Jampal Dorje he developed some kind of severe ailment that somehow barred him from being able to succeed his father on the throne. It's not exactly clear what happened, and of course the sources are very ambivalent about this, but we can probably assume that he suffered from some kind of stroke or an illness that would have severely impaired him physically or mentally. And so he's basically taken out of the limelight and kept in seclusion under the pretense of retreat. So when the Shabdrung died, the Bhutanese administration was in a bit of a problem. They had no one to succeed him. So on top of that, the threat from Tibet was still very real, and they feared that if the news of the Shabdrung's passing was to spread to Lhasa, the government of the Dalai Lamas would feel invigorated to send another army and this time quash the Bhutanese for good. So the small circle that knew that the Shabdrung had died basically decided to keep it a secret, claiming that the Shabdrung was still alive and well, albeit in strict retreat. And they kept this secret going for something like 50 years. And one wonders how they would have been able to keep this fiction for so long. And by the end, it was probably an open secret. But for all this time, food was still delivered to the Shabdrung's door and orders were still issued in his name. And so as they tried to solve the problem of succession, the administration gradually turned to the figure of Tenzin Rabgye, who was a distant nephew of the Shabdrung, and which John Arducci gave a talk on not long ago. So eventually Tenzin Rabgye was appointed as the Shabdrung's successor, but ultimately the administration started recognizing tulkus of the Shabdrung. And so because there were a lot of disputes as to the succession, in the end, there were multiple simultaneous reincarnations of the Shabdrung that were found. And so these were kind of organized or rationalized as reincarnations of the enlightened body, speech, and mind of the Shabdrung. And it's perhaps worth saying here that none of the subsequent reincarnations of the Shabdrung ever came close to the kind of authority and charisma that Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal came to occupy. Okay, so we're coming close to the hour, and so I'm just gonna make some brief comments about Sunkenshin, the biography of the Shabdrung and the literary architect behind the Bhutanese state. Sunkenshin was one of those rare individuals that represents the pinnacle of erudition of his time. His name, Sunkenshin, literally translates as the great scholar from Tsang, and his depth of knowledge in every domain was truly breathtaking. He's mostly known for writing the biography of the Shabdrung and for his artistic contributions to Bhutan, where he trained basically a whole generation of prominent Bhutanese artists who painted some of the most exquisite paintings, mural paintings in Bhutan, including at Tsang and at Tangbo. But Sunkenshin was also much more than an artist or a biographer. He penned numerous treatises on Buddhist philosophy and was considered really one of the major intellectuals of his time. Sunkenshin was born in the Nyang Valley, the upper Nyang Valley of Tsang as well, not far from Ralung, and his family had close ties to Ralung and the Gya. His father was from the important Nup clan, and he was a practitioner of the Nyingmapa school, even though he studied with important Drukpa masters, including Pema Karpo. So Sunkenshin, though, was ordained within the Sakya tradition, and his root teacher was the celebrated Sakyapa master Kenshin Lungrik Khinga Gyatso. And Sunkenshin studied at the important Sakya monastery of Serdokchen in Western Tibet, and he quickly became very acclaimed as a scholar at quite a young age. And so he was then recognized by the king of Tsang, Karma Tenkyong Wampo, who was the son of the king who died of smallpox. So he became recognized by the king of Tsang and was appointed by the king as the abbot of Chokur Dechen Monastery, which was this really large monastery in Shigatse that was built by the Tsang kings. Basically, this was one of the most prestigious positions that one could have at the time in the Tsang kingdom. When the forces of Gushli Khan eventually overthrew the Tsang kingdom, though, and installed the Ganten Podron government of the fifth Dalai Lama, Sunkenshin had to flee Tibet from fear of persecution. And so he took refuge in Bhutan, where he was welcomed by the Shabdrung and afforded really a place of great honor in the Bhutanese administration. There's no doubt that Sunkenshin's experience at the Tsang court and his witnessing of the violence and persecution perpetrated by the Ganten Podron government and their Mongol allies really deeply influenced his views on the Shabdrung state building project. He saw in Bhutan really a true refuge for persecuted individuals like himself. And he was wholly convinced by the promise of a Buddhist state under the Shabdrung. And so his biography of the Shabdrung, which is titled The Song of the Great Dharma Cloud, remains till date this enduring emblem of the Bhutanese state. And I would argue continues to really significantly influence Bhutanese understandings of governance and national identity. Sunkenshin composed the biography in the mid-1670s, so quite some time after the Shabdrung's death, even though the death was still a secret at the time. But the Shabdrung had himself personally requested him to write this when he was still alive. And recognizing that Sunkenshin was really the right person to not just write a biography eulogizing him, but composing this political work, articulating the theoretical foundations of the Bhutanese state. So for lack of time, I will only speak about two major themes in the biography, which really speak to the foundations of Bhutan as a state. So the first of these is the characterization of the Shabdrung as a divine figure who was preordained to come to Bhutan and found a Buddhist state there. The whole of the biography is centered around an understanding of the Shabdrung as a physical manifestation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, incarnating in the world for the benefit of sentient beings. And here I have just an image of Avalokiteshvara for you. So Sunkenshin theorized the period of Bhutan's founding as a degenerate age in need of a new dispensation of the Buddhist Dharma. And so for this, he drew on classical Indian understandings of the gradual waning of the Dharma after the death of the Buddha Shakyamuni, and the coming of an age of strife in which new Buddhas and Bodhisattvas would need to appear and basically redress the situation. So Sunkenshin understood the tumultuous period of the 17th century and all the wars and violence leading up to this moment as the signs of this degenerate age. And he saw in the arrival of the Shabdrung as the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara the ushering of a new fortunate era of happiness in the region. So for Sunkenshin, Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyel was very much a divine being who, out of compassion for sentient beings, took the mantle of kingship as a means of creating the right conditions for the flourishing of Buddhism and the ultimate welfare of sentient beings. So through the activities of a Buddhist king who protects the Buddhist teachings and establishes the rule of law in accordance with the classic Buddhist formulation of the 10 virtues, the Shabdrung basically brings peace and prosperity to the region, and he frees his subjects from fear and ushers this new era of happiness. This is not to say that the Shabdrung was an ordinary king, though, even a Buddhist one. For Sunkenshin, the Shabdrung was first and foremost the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, incarnating in human form to guide sentient beings in samsara. It's only because basically of the mess that sentient beings created that the most appropriate way for Avalokiteshvara to act in the world at that moment was through the activities of kingship. So Sunkenshin tells us in the biography that these activities of kingship basically translated into various concrete administrative initiatives, which brought the region back to a state of prosperity and happiness. And so besides instilling the rule of law, this includes the building and renovating of fortresses and tackling water scarcity through the development of irrigation systems, introducing new techniques in agriculture for better productivity and the intensification of trade, et cetera, et cetera. More importantly, however, these social programs are complemented with the flourishing and the spread of Buddhist teachings in the new state, where all the surplus wealth is basically reinvested into various Buddhist projects. And for Sunkenshin, this guaranteed the collective merit and fate of the Bhutanese inhabitants, who through their deep bond with the Shabdrung as Avalokiteshvara would become destined for the promise of enlightenment. As some of you may know, the Tibetan government of the 5th Dalai Lama made an almost identical argument with regard to the divinity of the Dalai Lamas some decades later. And there's significant enough reason to believe that Sunkenshin's work probably had a very deep influence on them. The second major theme of the biography, which is intimately linked to the first, is that not only was the Shabdrung Avalokiteshvara preordained to appear at the moment and guide sentient beings through the activities of kingship, but Bhutan itself was preordained as a physical manifestation of Avalokiteshvara's pure land. In other words, Sunkenshin recognized the region of Bhutan as a physical manifestation of Avalokiteshvara's mythical paradise, this kind of wondrous and privileged space for the flourishing of the Buddha Dharma, that had drawn and had been blessed by countless masters in the past, including, of course, Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche. We could say that Sunkenshin basically understood the region of Bhutan to be a kind of utopia, an earthly paradise that was intimately connected to Avalokiteshvara and the Shabdrung as their field of activity. The whole of the natural environment of Bhutan, including its various local deities, were all aligned with the project of the Shabdrung and participants in his creating of an enlightened society there. For Sunkenshin, the physical beauty and the lushness of Bhutan, in contrast to the dry and arid landscapes of Tibet, were physical signs of its status as a special abode and site for the flourishing of the Dharma. So these two elements, I contend, so the recognition of the Shabdrung as a divine figure ushering this new fortunate era of happiness, and the recognition of Bhutan as this earthly paradise intimately linked to the divinity of the Shabdrung and the flourishing of Buddhism, I would argue continue to impact Bhutan in really profound ways. So much of Bhutan's understanding of national identity can be tied to Sunkenshin's theorization of the state in the Song of the Great Dharma Cloud. For one, Sunkenshin's theorization of the founding of Bhutan as ushering a new fortunate era of happiness could very well be seen as a kind of precursor to the modern Bhutanese philosophy of gross national happiness. But more importantly, though, Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, in many ways, continues to be the ultimate referent of authority in the kingdom today. And the Bhutanese understanding of Bhutan as a space is deeply tied to the notion of Bhutan as this blessed and sacred space ripe for the flourishing of Buddhism. So I think I've reached the hour mark, and so I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions to the best of my abilities on anything I've spoken about. I hope that whatever I've presented today can just catch a small glimpse of the kind of remarkable developments that took place in Bhutan in the 17th century and kind of figures that were behind this. So thank you.